Right. Welcome, everyone. This is our program, How to Resist Anti-Semitism by Dr. Amy Carr. Dr. Carr is a professor in race, religion, gender, and multidisciplinary studies in the department at WIU. And we're honored that she has agreed to repeat a program that was so successful in January, the demand that let's have it again. So again, this is Dr. Amy Carr. She's here to educate and to inform, and we ask that you please turn off your mic if you aren't asking a question, because that sound will inevitably disturb us. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And thank you, Carl, for being in charge of the recording. There's so many ways you can approach the topic of anti-Semitism. So if anybody were a historian of a particular period, they would say so many other things. What I'd like to do today is sort of talk about the history of anti-Judaism and how anti-Judaism came to be defined over time as anti-Semitism. And also try to work with some of the harder questions that we're in the middle of right now, especially with the war between Israel and Gaza. Anti-Semitism as a term was coined in 1879 by William Marr, a German journalist, and somebody who called himself an anti-Semite. So he was promoting the term. So by the end of the talk, I hope you have a sense of why this term appeared when it did in 1879. In a broad sense, both Arabic and Hebrew are Semitic languages. So one definition of anti-Semitism would include Arabs as well. But we're going to talk today about the definition of anti-Semitism that is at heart about hatred of Jews. And so my aim today is going to be to flesh out more of the nuances of what that means and how anti-Semitism is bound up with many kinds of struggles to name and address real or perceived social problems and to position oneself on the correct side of them. And I want to add to that, while some might boldly proclaim themselves anti-Semitic, anti-Semitism has a way also of seeming normal and invisible. It is on the rise. If any of you heard NPR this morning, my friend Jason DeRose, who works for NPR, reported that a recent survey found the state of anti-Semitism in America found that 94% of Jews and 74% of US adults who were surveyed say anti-Semitism is a very serious problem or somewhat serious. Also found that American Jews are uncertain about their place in American society. Almost 2/3 say their status is less secure than a year ago. And almost half say they've changed their behavior due to fear. So not wearing prominent, this is in the US now, not wearing prominent Jewish symbols, kind of avoiding identifying publicly as Jewish. But even before that was the case, I can get this to work here. My screen. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare a moment here my slides, which means you're going to see. Okay. See if this works. There were, before the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, there were already more hate crimes against Jews than against any other religion in the United States. So 2022, 10 times as many, right? As many as against Catholics and more than against Sikh and Muslims. Since October 7th, and again, I'm assuming some knowledge of current events, but when Hamas attacked and killed over 1,200 or about 1,200 civilians in Israel, and Israel responded with a massive invasion into Gaza, these numbers have gone way up. And so a 60% increase in hate crimes against US Jews after October 7th. So FBI Director Christopher Wray talked about this in the Senate Judiciary Committee back in December, thinking about 60% more hate crimes post October 7th than compared to beforehand. And of course, Islamophobia has gone up. Hate crimes against Muslims, against Palestinians, against Arabs have also gone up as well. So what are some examples of anti-Semitism? One of the things that, as we have time at the end for discussion, I'd be curious what kinds you have heard of or you might associate with. One that was more personal for me is I have a friend who's a rabbi, Rabbi Wendy Love Anderson at Temple Israel in Albany, New York. And just before Hanukkah this past fall, there was a gunman on their steps, but some neighbors called. He was arrested, and last I heard, they were prosecuting or pursuing the possibility of a hate crime. In addition to things like the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, those are some really obvious kinds of anti-Semitic activities. There's also reports about, even in Los Angeles, Jewish kids getting harassed after the invasion of Gaza by Israel. And then there's others, they cross the gamut. So in early January, there were flyers put in Chicago's Andersonville neighborhood that blamed Jews for the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which were due to Al-Qaeda, an Islamist group. There were signs on cars in the Jefferson Park neighborhood in Chicago in November that said, Jews control BLM, or Black Lives Matter, and Antifa. Jews are behind the anti-white narrative, resist. So you can see there's a spectrum of ways as we see that anti-Semitism works, or critique of Jews exists from many different perspectives. This I find really interesting. And again, at the end, I'd like to see if any of you might have insights into this statistic. As of a December poll, 67% of 18 to 24-year-olds, again, this is in the US, think that Jews as a class are oppressors and should be treated as oppressors. So I'm wondering why 67% of young people think Jews as a class are oppressors. 33% think that's false. And interestingly, in the same age group, 69% think Israel has a right to exist. So interesting to put those side by side. So while there's a lot of agreement about hate crimes, I think more broadly, there's also a lot of places where people have questions about whether something is anti-Semitic. Claudine Gay, as some of you may know, there's been some campuses have a lot of protests for and against Israel, for and against Gaza. Claudine Gay resigned as president of Harvard in part because of pressure in which she said genocide against Jews could be acceptable speech in some contexts. There's also been a complaint filed that the U.S. Department of Education is exploring at Northwestern and also at the University of Illinois Chicago for, quote, failing to respond appropriately to incidents of harassment last fall. Now, I think it might be that the U.S. Department of Education is obligated to do this, but it's interesting to ask whether does say a protest on behalf of Palestinians where you're projecting the Palestinian flag onto the wall of the library, is that anti-Semitic? Is a student walkout demanding that a university end its relationships with organizations that support Israel anti-Semitic? What about a sign at a protest that says resist colonial power by any means necessary? So there are these questions that we can ask about those things. So even if we came to agreement about what does and doesn't constitute anti-Semitism, we'd find it comes from both conservatives and progressives, those who identify as religious and those who not. So another variant is I saw like evangelical Christians might associate Jews with cosmopolitan liberal elites. Right, so you can get anti-Jewish sentiments from many kinds of point of view. So how can that be? Here it's important to understand, well, what do we mean when we talk about people who are Jews? On one hand, Judaism is a religion older than Christianity and Islam, and those religions have inherited a lot of their features from Judaism. But Jews are also a people, a family, an extended family. So I'm calling them here an indigenous people with a historic tie to a land. And because of that, you can have somebody be a secular Jew. You don't have to believe in God to be Jewish in that sense, because you're part of this larger family. A little more than half of Israel's Jews identify as secular in some sense. Those living away from Israel are often called diasporic Jews, spread out from beyond the land of Israel. So that very word implies there's a historic tie to a land. And that land the word Jew itself comes from the word Judah, which was once one of the two kingdoms split from Israel in the 10th century BCE. And then later, both Israel and Judah were conquered by a series of empires: Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman. And later, the lands of Israel and Judah were part of the Christian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Christian Byzantine Empire, and then various Muslim empires, ending with the Ottoman Empire and briefly the British Empire before Israel became a country again in 1948, 1947. So that Jews have a historical tie to land doesn't mean every Jew wants to live in Israel. About half of the world's Jews do right now. But it would be a mistake to think that Judaism is just a religious identity. And this is important when we think about the tensions around Israel. Zionism, a term I'd actually be curious what associations, if any of you have, with the term Zionism. It can mean many things. The word Zion refers to a hill near Jerusalem that's mentioned a lot in the Psalms in the Bible. And in the late 20th or early 20th century, Theodor Herzl led a movement to look for a safe Jewish homeland for Jews who faced persecution as minorities. Zionism had many, many parties. There were secular parties, socialist parties, religious parties. They had many ideas about where Jews could live safely. So Zionism is in part the search for a safe place for Jews to live. Ultimately, that place became a place some wanted to move to, which was Israel. And this was made possible in part by sympathy after the Holocaust. See a variety of perspectives here. But the problem with this, of course, is that there was a saying among Jews: a people without a land for a land without a people. There hadn't been a nation there that had been part of the Ottoman Empire. There had been Jews living there, and Jews were beginning to migrate there. But as many of you know, there was another people with a claim to indigeneity there, the Palestinians. And they generated other narratives about the formation of the state of Israel. It's like Nakba, catastrophe, apartheid, settler colonialism. Even though most Jews in Israel are not white, are not Ashkenazi Jews even necessarily from Germany, you get a claim that you see that there's still Jews who came from all over North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Europe. And the image on the left here is just, again, I know some know this well and others don't at all, at least I find with students. The Palestinian territories are on the left, Gaza Strip by Egypt, and then the West Bank of the Jordan River near Jordan. And they are run by separate folks, and they're occupied territories. Since 1967, the Israeli military controls them. It controls their boundaries. And the West Bank, as you can see on the right side from a Palestinian perspective, the amount of land that Palestinians can call their own has shrunk. And the run on the far right here, 2010, shows that there are legal Jewish settlements in Israel, which again shrinks the places where Palestinians have autonomy. So there's a phrase, from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, that reflects Palestinians' wish to dwell on the same land. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, we're talking about, in the contemporary period, we're also talking about trying to reflect on it within the context of two competing claims of indigeneity in the land of Israel and Palestine. Jews are understood as both victims who are reclaiming a safe space and oppressors who are committing genocide against Palestinians. And that term genocide, right, is a contested one, but it's an accusation, and it's one that the UN is exploring. So anti-Semitism's meaning taps into both the religious and the peoplehood senses of being Jewish. And here I want to try to share a video. It's a short video, and I'm happy to share these slides. All these slides have links in them, and also to share this video if anybody would like. So let's see if I can get out of here and do that. First, I have to name this. Okay.
Those who traffic in that kind of language are on very thin ice. My understanding of anti-Semitism is the following. Anti-Semitism is not simply hating the other, the Jew as other. Anti-Semitism works a little bit differently. What anti-Semitism does is turn the Jews, the Jew, into the symbol of whatever it is that a given civilization defines as its most loathsome qualities. And so, under Christianity before the Holocaust and Vatican II, the Jew was the Christ killer. His blood be upon our heads and upon our children. That's forever. Under communism, the Jew was the capitalist. Under Nazism, the Jew was the race polluter, the ultimate race polluter. Now we live in a different civilization. Now we live in the civilization where the most loathsome qualities are racism, colonialism, apartheid. And lo and behold, the greatest offender in the world today, with all the beautiful countries of the world, is the Jewish state. The Jewish state is the symbol of the genocidal, racist, apartheid state. That's Israel. That's the Jewish state. An Israeli political philosopher named Yaakov Talmon once put it this way: the state of the Jews has become the Jew of the states. What that means to me is criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. Criticism of Israel's existence, denying Israel the right to exist, calling Israel the Zionist entity, that is anti-Semitism. That is a classical continuity of thousands of years of symbolizing the Jew. So using that kind of language places you in very uncomfortable company. That kind of language can come today from the far left. It can come from white supremacists. It can come from Islamist extremists. It can come from many sources. But all of those groups converge on one idea: the Jew remains humanity's great problem.
So, all right. So I forgot to mention that that video is from DePaul a few years ago, DePaul University. That was by Yossi Klein Halevi. I'll be showing you an image of him later as well. He was asked, he was giving tours in the US. He's written a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And he was asked if, by a student at DePaul, isn't supporting Zionism like supporting the KKK, like supporting the Ku Klux Klan? So that was his response, right? To say criticizing Israel's policy is different from criticizing Israel's right to exist. Now, not everybody would agree with his take there, but that is one common way to describe the difference. So link to that there. So what I'd like to do with the kind of next part of my presentation before wrapping it up is to talk about, break apart what he said here, casting Jews as the symbol of whatever a society most opposes, finds most loathsome. For Christians, Jews are Christ killers. For communists, Jews are capitalists or capitalist pigs. And for capitalists too, many communist sympathizers were Jews. So you can see that when Jews getting accused of being communists or accused of being capitalists. There were many among communist parties. In the US, there's often been back and forth between somebody who was Jewish or somebody who was actually Finnish. I'm from Upper Michigan, where there's a lot of Finnish Americans, and in the earlier 20th century, there would be little towns in the UP that would divide it between the church Finns on one side of the streets and the red Finns on the other, right? So you see this kind of among Jews as well. For Nazis and white nationalists, Jews are race polluters, and then legacies of racism and colonialism. So I'd like to go over each of those a bit. First, the idea that Jews are Christ killers. So there's a long history of Christian anti-Judaism, partly out of the cognitive dissonance that Christians center their worship on Jesus, but most Jews don't see Jesus as a Messiah or as the central figure, a savior figure. And as Yossi Klein Halevi said, he was quoting Matthew 27:25. In that particular gospel, Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate, and there's a crowd of Jews there who say, his blood be upon us and upon our children. If you've ever seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, they use the original language, but they don't subtitle that part that's said in Aramaic by the crowd because there was a fear it would spark riots or pogroms against Jews, particularly in Europe. So there's a long history of Christian persecution of Jews, from destroying synagogues to expelling them. So this is just an image. Those circles are places where there was at least one expulsion. The bigger the circle, the more expulsions. In Spain, there were forced conversions. The Spanish Inquisition would then go over those, pursue those who had ostensibly converted to Christianity, but who were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. In 1492, you don't just have Columbus leaving to find the New World or finding the New World, the Americas, but you have expulsions of Jews from Spain as well as Moors, Muslim Moors from Spain. You have accusations when a Christian baby died that maybe a Jew had killed them to use their blood in Passover bread. Traditions of Christian boys beating up Jewish boys on Good Friday, claiming Jews killed Jesus, although it was actually the Roman governor Pontius Pilate who did. Italian Jews forced into ghettos with curfews by Pope Pius IV in 1555. A long litany of things that Christians have done well before the Holocaust killed a third of the world's Jews. So, since the Holocaust, there has been a great deal of Christian-Jewish dialogue. I myself am a Lutheran theologian. Lutherans have apologized for Martin Luther's, he wrote a treatise called On the Jews and Their Lies. Right, so there's been a real effort to have a reckoning with Christian anti-Judaism, and Vatican II in 1962 to 65 was one part of that. US Catholic bishops made a statement after Vatican II that they no longer target Jews for conversion. Jews have their own covenant with God. And if you read Romans chapters 9 to 11, Jews and Christians reading that book together have argued that what Paul was really saying was that Christianity is an extension of the Jewish covenant to Gentiles or non-Jews through Jesus. And that in the end, when Paul says, and all Israel will be saved, and it's a mystery, Paul argues that it's actually God's will, it was the plan that most Jews don't accept Jesus as the Messiah so that Gentiles can come into the covenant that God made with Abraham, a Jewish ancestor. So that's something to track, sort of Jewish-Christian dialogue after the Holocaust. A second kind of stereotype of Jews as rich is tied into Christian anti-Judaism as well. We don't really talk much about usury, but it used to be considered a sin to charge interest on a loan. And the way in medieval Europe this would work is that Christians would see themselves, the church, as the new Israel. So they'd read themselves as the Israelites in this commandment in Deuteronomy, a text Jews and Christians share. And they would consider Jews themselves a foreigner because you could charge a foreigner interest. So Christians put Jews in the position of lending out money to Christians. Jews weren't allowed to own land in Europe. And again, I'm overgeneralizing. There's more specifics in different times and places. But the reason one reason there's an association of Jews and wealth is because Jews were forced to occupy the role of money lenders. And then with the rise of capitalism and Catholic canon law making a case that, hey, it's okay to charge interest on the loan, Jews were in a position because they were already in the role of money lending to own banks. So before the Holocaust, yes, Jews owned banks in Frankfurt. But there's a history there of Christian anti-Judaism, or at least of this way of relating, right? Jews have this particular place in society, and and then were able to benefit if they were in the banking industry for a time. Before I talk about the communist accusation, one thing that's really important that shifted in the 19th century, and this has to do with the definition of anti-Semitism popping up in 1879, is emancipation. So in the US, emancipation was the end of slavery. In the 19th century, again, in different times and places in Europe, it was the right of Jews to become citizens of European countries. And when that happened, Jews were able to leave the ghettos. They were able to convert to Christianity, like Felix Mendelssohn did. They were able to be as assimilated to Gentile culture as they wanted or not. It's here in the 19th century in Germany when you get Jews sort of more free to form different branches of Judaism. So you get Reform Judaism, where they don't even have to eat kosher to be Jewish. Conservative Jews who keep more of the Jewish rituals, but in a more flexible way, and Orthodox Jews that are the most ritually observant Jews, and many things in between. But suddenly then the fear was that Jews were too much like everybody else. And so you begin to get that fear that Jews are race polluters as well. If you don't know who is a Jew, then suddenly you're afraid that somebody could marry a Jew, a Gentile could marry a Jew, a German say could marry a German who's not a Jewish could marry one. So emancipation, that word anti-Semitism is tied up with this, and it's the idea that Jews are a race and not just it's not just a religious identification now, right? So, but playing with that idea of a peoplehood as a dangerous race. So you can see that in a book like the one on the right from 1934. But I found this on a white supremacist looking website called Occidental Descent. The image is titled Jew Pervert. And then the image on the left about the fear of Jews being in charge of all the world's money, right? That's part of it. So as quote Moshe Zimmerman here, who's a historian in Israel, the Jews became national-oriented Germans, so we're talking about the German context here, and the German nationalists said, we don't want them, and invented the new anti-Semitism. Before they hated the Jews because they were different, now they hated them because they were trying to be similar. So for the Soviets, going back to the accusation of Jews as capitalist pigs, there was also Soviet persecution of Jews. And one of these associations of Zionism as racism, or the KKK you see on the image here from 1970, this idea that Zionism is racism goes back decades, right? It goes back to the efforts to describe Israel itself as an apartheid colonialist regime by communist countries like the Soviet Union. And there's been a back and forth about this idea of equating Zionism with racism. But as is pointed out here, only the Jewish form of national self-expression was called into question by the UN. And again, that's part of Yossi Klein Halevi's point that there can be problems of many kinds, but singling out Jews as kind of the worst expression of a problem is one way of understanding anti-Semitism. So I'll come back to that image in a moment. I want to go back to the context we're in today. And again, I find with my students in my classes that there's a real diverse some follow the news and some don't, about the war between Israel and Gaza and the general relationships between Israel and Palestine. So there's debates about whether there ought to be one Palestinian state with Jews living as a minority, or one Greater Israel, it's called, that would take charge of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as well. And then those who argue for a two-state solution. And there are many, many perspectives about that. So part of the challenge of talking about anti-Semitism in the context of some of the tensions on the debate about Israel and Palestine is that folks feel really drawn to taking sides. And it can become, you can lose trust in one another, even in the United States, but certainly even more in Israel and Palestine. And some of the examples of this that I think can be the most problematic if we're thinking about anti-Semitism would be, say, a testimony at an Oakland, California City Council meeting where some were saying that Hamas didn't really kill over 1,000 Israeli citizens or civilians on October 7th. So kind of denying the facts or openly defending Hamas's actions as actions of self-defense. So that's a question maybe we can talk about a little bit. I'd be curious about your experiences there. Jews have been scapegoats in shifting ways. So a couple other points I want to make, and then I'll close with a list of like 7 suggestions. For white Christian nationalists and white supremacy groups, Jews are coded alongside Blacks as not white, or a cosmopolitan liberal elite seeking to impose its values. For those who see Israel as a settler colonialist state, Jews might be coded as white oppressors, depending what is the thing that you fear the most, right? Or see as the most problematic. And one refrain you'll hear about the US left is, why do some people in their circles express solidarity with virtually every beleaguered group, every minority, and every victim, except the Jews? And here's another dynamic that I see at play. And here I'm taking some analogies from sayings regarding Native Americans in the US history. So anti-Semitism is a variant of forced assimilation, or trying to prod Jews towards or away from a particular kind of Jewish identity. So you may have heard the saying, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. So that would parallel with, I wish Hitler had killed all the Jews, right? Or parallel sayings like that. Some of you might also know that the history of boarding schools, in which Native Americans, children were forced to not speak their native language, were taken from the reservation. And this was seen as a civilizing gesture. This sign in this boarding school in Carlisle in Pennsylvania: kill the Indian, save the man. This slogan was seen as humanizing, right? A way of civilizing savages, of integrating Native Americans into a vision of belonging that didn't depend on their attachment to a land that others wanted. So it was about trying to convert the sensibilities of Native peoples. And perhaps there's a parallel there with the sentiment that the only good Jew is a Jew who rejects any form of Zionism, any form of sense of connection to or wanting to have a state of Israel. Kill Zionism, save the soul of Judaism. Or you can take this from the perspective of the right-wing government that's in power in Israel right now. The only good Jew is one who supports the Israeli government's policies without criticism, right? You can see that dynamic playing in both ways. Yeah, I could share some quotes from folks who are concerned that they're not welcome, say, at protests about Israel's attack on Gaza, because they might, unless they denounce Zionism in and of itself. So, and again, what Zionism means to different people, ask what somebody means by that term. So my suggestions for how to resist anti-Semitism. First, be wary about singling out Jews or Israel as uniquely the people or country, or the worst people or country that wrestles with the tensions of ethno-nationalism, authoritarianism, or any other form of sin or oppression that is taking center stage, such as colonialism, racism, and so on. I subscribe to Haaretz, which means the land, which is an Israeli newspaper that is openly critical of the Israeli government, at least many voices. They have many voices, it's a news source. But they'll regularly be concerned about Israeli Jewish fascism, right? They'll be concerned about authoritarian tendencies. Before October 7th, there had been hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews protesting efforts by the right-wing government to change the nature of the judiciary. So there are plenty of debates among Jews and the same tensions that we see everywhere. But to say that somehow give more attention to Jews or Israel than any others, that's something to ponder. I would say the second one is really important. Call out as inaccurate or at least partial the narrative that a Jewish identity is only a religious identity. So if you follow movements like boycott, divest, Sanctions Against Israel, BDS. One of their platform claims is the idea that Judaism is a religion and not a people. So the platform of the official organization would be for the right of return of Palestinians, but with the assumption that Israel would not be a state. So again, folks can have many perspectives on that, but to deny that Jews have are a people with historic ties to a land, that would be something to ponder, potentially anti-Semitic. I would say also learn more about Christian Jewish and Muslim Jewish dialogue, including ways Christians have begun to reckon with their history of anti-Judaism. And there's parallel things in Islam, but traditionally, historically, Jews have fared much better in Muslim lands than in Christian ones. Be aware that Jews have long wrestled with the tensions between belonging to the Jewish people and assimilating into larger society, as well as debates among Jews about Zionism, gender norms, and everything else. I could say a lot more about that if anyone wants. But the upshot is that means being cautious about declaring which subset of Jews are truly Jewish and which are not really Jewish. Jews can accuse one another of anti-Semitism as well. So for an example, there was a Canadian group, a Zionist group that said that any liberal Zionists who saw a place for a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, that's anti-Semitism, right? That's instead of seeing disagreement about that, accuse them of anti-Semitism. So that relates to the fifth point. Charges of anti-Semitism can themselves be weaponized to further other ends. So I'm not fleshing this all out here, but there's also a Christian evangelical worldview, not all evangelicals, but it's one strand that sees Israel's rebirth as a country as a sign that the end of the world is near. So you have this dynamic in which Christian evangelicals may be very pro-Israel, but also see Jews themselves as because they see it as a sign that Jesus is going to return, but then also see Jews as part of this liberal elite, right? Behind the liberal elite somehow, as in some of those signs put up in the Jefferson Park neighborhood in Chicago. A sixth, I think, is really important too. Be less afraid of saying the wrong thing and more courageous about using all the tension around anti-Semitism discussions to drive a search for better understanding history and the debates about the conditions of identity and belonging for various peoples. And the last one, I find it useful, and I have for decades, to pay attention to the peace groups in Israel and Palestine and elsewhere too, with the groups that are trying to hear both narratives about belonging to the land called Palestine and Israel, and are trying to sort out pathways to compromise and coexistence. And they do that in a variety of ways. So here again, Yossi Klein Halevi, he, at the initiative of an imam at Duke University, Muslim Imam Abdullah, they have been leading groups, certainly before the war at least, Muslims in the US, visiting Jerusalem, meeting with Jews. Imam Abdullah talks about the anti-Semitism he grew up with in Turkey and how actually classical Quranic training led him to see that those were not classically Muslim views that he was learning in everyday culture in Turkey. So he's been one who's worked against anti-Semitism from a Muslim perspective. This is the peace group. I listened to a webinar with them a few weeks ago. Roots, a Palestinian-Israeli peace initiative in the West Bank, and one of their visions is two truths in one heart, two peoples in one land. It's very hard right now for folks in a place like the West Bank, which is under a lot of, even though it's not the Gaza Strip, it's under a lot of Israeli, there's curfews in the towns more. Some people are being killed there, but the leaders of this organization are still trying to do things to lift up a vision of coexistence. And that includes Israeli settlers in the West Bank. And the last group I want to mention that I've been following, Standing Together, a new group in Israel itself that's bringing together Israeli Arabs and Jews amid the war. And I want to close with the words of an Israeli Arab. 20% of Israel's citizens are Arab. Some might identify as Palestinian, some as Israeli Arab. And she's talking about why she felt so empty after visiting America and speaking about what is happening. She said, discussion there is so disconnected from our life, our challenges, our reality. Each side has its fantasies about what Israel is and what the liberation of Palestine means. I asked them how the debate between them and the social media helps people in Israel who are in a war situation, are experiencing attacks, are caught in deep trauma, are burying their dead, worrying about captives or being bombed. They don't have answers. They are fighting a war of narratives over who is more correct. With the Jewish side, I felt like I had to contain their pain, even though they did not actually experience the assault, but only a distant collective trauma, without understanding that I experienced an actual trauma as an Israeli, an Israeli Arab. And by the way, when Hamas attacked on October 7th, they killed Arabs as well as Jews. With the Palestinian side, she continues, I felt they were being judgmental because I was working with Jews. One of the Muslims we met asked me, what is the Zionist liberal shit that you're part of? The two sides refuse to see that Arab people and Jewish people live here with their own desires, feelings, traumas, and shared experiences. The encounters and the talks required me to take in the fears of each side. The American Jews who are afraid of anti-Semitism, and justly so, and Palestinian Americans who are appalled at the possibility that their relatives will die. And I find that helpful to think about because very often debates about anti-Semitism are debates about our own identities. And by our, I mean that in a very broad sense. And expressions of anti-Semitism reflect a fear of being personally identified with or overwhelmed by the wrong category of people, morally or in other ways. So I've tried to give a few examples of that. And I think I will end here.
Dr. Carr, can you hear me?
Thank you.
All right. Questions? Just in my minorities class, which is in this time period, we're going to be looking at Jewish immigration and Jewish people as a minority a bit later. And just to add on to what you were saying, when we teach that in sociology, they're not considered a minority group based on religion. It's based on ethnicity because it's shared culture.
So that's
yeah, that is how we teach it.
So it's interesting to define ethnicity there, right? Because it includes many kinds of races and what we call races too, right? So
because what you're talking about is a shared people, family, that's culture, which makes it ethnicity. But that's how we teach it in sociology. You don't have to be religious, you don't have to practice Judaism. You are a minority called part of the Jew. Students, any questions? We have students here. Jeff? Questions? Either timid or...
And anybody else who's on the call is welcome to raise a question as well. It's a little bit hard for me to read the chat, but share a question.
We have a few people on. Does anyone on Zoom have a question?
Or a comment for that matter. Does anybody have any ideas about why 2/3 in the US of people 18 to 24 think of Jews as an oppressor class?
That's a great question. A lot of young Americans think, overwhelmingly think Jews are the oppressor class compared to previous surveys and compared to other generations. Yeah, I think one of the big reasons. They're what? Uninformed. Okay, can you hear her? She said she thinks they're uninformed.
Yeah, but I guess what's the question? What is the assumption that would lead someone to say Jews are an oppressor class?
Yeah, I would question whether they're informed. Yeah.
I was gonna say that issue that we have throughout, like, from history is like Jewish people being pulled off of that some sort might make us feel like they oppress us. Or the classes, they your higher class that other people
Okay, so they're perceived as, and actually there's data to back that up as more successful or wealthier, if you look at them as a group. I would have said, what about social media, folks? What is the influence of social media on 18 to 24-year-olds' views of Jews? Yeah.
There's two people on the left, you have the idea of like Israel being a colonial regime. There's
Okay.
where Palestine is on the right, people who are like more are conservative, might see the Jewish people as part of the deep state or trying to control it.
Okay.
People on the left that might see Israel as on the right, that they are part of why it happens in minority, because people on the left and the right have the Jewish on that.
Are you able to catch that? I'm not sure where, how the audience is depending on what people are sitting. Amy, did you hear that?
I heard something about the settler colonialist idea, but could you recap a little bit, Tammy? Or ask somebody to come up to the mic?
Well, there's mics all over, but it's just some places might be dead zone. So he made a great point. See, on the left, you've got sort of the settler colonialism. On the right, you have older part of the deep state. And what I love about that's a great comment, because that shape shifting that you're talking about, the scapegoating theory in that video clip, it really fits with that. It's the catch-all for whoever, depending on where they're coming from. Huh? Anyway, I'll let you comment on that. And then we do have somebody, Dr. Jeff Hanks. What would you like?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to mention that the woman I was quoting at the end, the Israeli Arab, is named Sally Abed. And I think one of the things she's pointing out is that so often the debate, like there's some on the left or the progressive side, like will feel like and this you might also look at like among young people, what their own, racial and ethnic backgrounds are about as well, right? So do more African Americans, for example, identify with the Palestinian cause and see the connections there with that word apartheid being used, right? Even if there are differences. And again, you'll find some Jews who will identify very much with the Palestinian narratives in the U.S. There can be divisions among families, tensions around that as well. And so I think the challenge there is to say, yeah, there's two narratives. There's a Palestinian and Israeli sense of identity on the land, but notice again how well, it's a more complicated narrative that, right? How do we move from those ideological narratives to really getting at the historical nuances and getting that in a way that isn't just about, as Sally Abed said, kind of fighting a war of narratives over who is more correct, tying into one's own identity, right? So a white person in the United States who wants to be opposed to racism might want to side with Hamas. I mean, you've seen that, right? Even though they might not have done that with the folks who committed 9/11. Hamas is an Islamist organization that's vowed death to Israel. And most people in Gaza haven't actually necessarily supported it. But in the middle of war, right? It's much more tense. Did I miss though, Tammy, something that you were a dimension of what you were saying, or?
Jeff Hanks is here, Dr. Hanks.
Okay. So I have a question. What you thought about the giant swing and miss at the congressional hearing with Dr. Gay and the principal and the president at Penn, and what that said maybe about the state of relations, anti-Semitism, particularly at elite universities, that we're seeing it even more so than at
Yeah. Actually, most universities don't have those levels of tension. Well, I understood from that those congressional interviews and again, that's an example, I think, of those on the political right trying to weaponize anti-Semitism and paint elite universities as anti-Semitic for their own ends. I do what the best account, I guess, that I heard, or one that resonated for me, was that these presidents are always trying to speak legalese. They're trying to speak in a way that it's going to discourage lawsuits, right? So they want to thread that line between allowing free speech and then not being anti-Semitic or anti-Palestinian either, right? So I don't know, maybe you have more insights than that, but that's how I read that Claudine Gay was trying to think about there's a difference between actually targeting somebody and then allowing free speech. Although she apologized for that, right? It's hard to see that as acceptable, but that's the environment I think she was trying to operate in. Trying to say the right thing legally to avoid lawsuits.
The thing that wasn't discussed that I would bring up from feminist perspective is would the reaction have been the same had they been white men?
Yeah.
And not.
And a woman of color at that, right? The first Black woman who's president of Harvard. When do we lift up certain weapons and when don't we, right?
And when are they more effective and when are they not?
Yeah.
I'm gonna stir the pot. So I have one question. It was interesting at one point you used the term indigenous or no?
I did. I used the
You reference which makes sense if you're looking at a claim on the land, right? And the long history and attachment to the land. But to me, that just brings up from a US perspective, if I'm talking to the US government, okay, then what about Native Americans? So what are we gonna do about that? Because if Israel is allowed to defend what they perceive as their land at any cost, and I have huge problems with that, then why should Native Americans be just given back their land?
Yeah, that question. And I think that by saying an indigenous people, I mean a historic sense of identification with the land of Israel. So that can translate into lots of ways. So if you were to look at that, like a group like Roots, that includes both Israeli Jewish settlers and West Bank Palestinians, they have a vision that of a state that would have a kind of somewhat autonomy, like they'd have some separation of the government, but also be one, right? So there's many variations, right? But to your point, no, I grew up in a reservation town in Upper Michigan, and I remember I was a friend of mine in the debate team was visiting me, and she said, by the way, and she was 17 and I was 15. I didn't know any of this. She knew so many things. She said, by the way, the land that your house is on was sold by somebody who was Native under the Dawes Act, which broke up reservation tribal lands and allowed individual natives to sell it. And the tribe was trying to get that land back. And what's happening now is if somebody Native buys land in the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, where it was sort of rounded the towns I grew up in, then they may not sell it to anybody else but another Native, right? So you've certainly got Native sovereignty visions that take many forms as well. So I guess the answer to your question would be, how do we honor collectively across all of these different identities, but also across different kinds of boundaries, like national, international. Tribes have sovereignty in every way except with regard to federal law in the US. How do we honor the claims to indigeneity in ways that respect multiple peoples? And there's more than one kind of answer to that. But to me, the problem is denying a claim to indigeneity at all for Jews or native persons.
That's the other challenge, and it's unfortunate, but it's been allowed to happen, and that is the conflation of where if you say anything to criticize Israel's policy, and I don't mean just since Hamas's attack, this has been going on in the US for a long time.
Yeah.
That you are accused of being anti-Semitic. And that's such a huge problem, and I've been regretting lately that was allowed, that that's never been teased out, because it's made it very easy then to just shut people down.
That's why I say enter the tension, right? Use your try, right? And yes, the anti-Semitism can be weaponized to shut down criticism of Israel, absolutely. But it can also be used in a way that says Israel has no legitimacy, right? So how do we speak with nuance and who's we, right? So we could ask in the US, I heard something like one media outlet had like 60, or there's like 60 people in Israel and Palestine, and then 20 people to cover the rest of the world. Israel and Palestine are getting disproportionate attention. more than Sudan, more than Nagorno-Karabakh. How many people know about the, all the Armenians who fled Nagorno-Karabakh and as Azerbaijan took control of it? What's going on in Myanmar? But of course, the US is directly funding Israel. So there's also that kind of moral connection and responsibility there as well. But yeah, I remember being, when I was younger, wondering about that as well. And that's why, that clip by Yossi Klein Halevi, he distinguishes between criticizing Israel, which he does himself a lot. He's an Israeli Jew, criticizes Benjamin Netanyahu, the president, a lot. And criticizing the idea that Israel has a right to exist. Now, somebody may disagree with that, that Israel has a right to exist. But I think the part that I would fall on as considering it anti-Semitic is when somebody said it's wrong for somebody who's Jewish to have a sense of connection to the homeland. So one of the things, in Palestinian schools, there's been some teaching that the Jews never had a temple, never had a historic homeland. Right? And so those are historical inaccuracies. But long answer to your question.
It is very, very complicated.
It is.
Any questions? Last chance, folks. Anyone on Zoom? I really appreciate your taking your time and doing this for us. We're actually going to be covering, like I said, Jews as a minority group a little bit later. Also the Dawes Act, by the way, that's coming up very soon. So this is kind of early on in terms of exposure, but it's a great kind of foreshadowing and to set us up for what we're covering later too. And it's just so important right now. If nothing else, stop and think, right, before we march into these issues.
Well, thank you very much for your attention on late in the afternoon here, and
thank you.
Great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Does somebody here know Tessa? Tessa is? Tessa, are you still there? I'm going to say send me an email to, I guess, Carl, you could do that too. Oh, okay. Tessa, if you can hear me, put your email address in here and we'll get you the recording. Or you can email. Yeah, thanks. Carl, can you snag that? I'll try to as well. I think we can start recording now, though.